She was 21 years old, she had $14 to her name, and the only thing anyone in the county wanted to sell her was a mill no one else would touch. We want to tell you about Hazel Birch, not because her story is tidy, or because it ended the way you might expect, but because it is the kind of story that has a way of finding the people who need it most. If you have ever stood in front of a door that should have been yours and found it locked against you, stay with us. This one is for you. Hazel Birch was born in the late summer in a small river town called Granger's Bend, tucked into the hill country of eastern Tennessee, where the creek ran fast in spring and the sycamores turned the color of old copper in October. Her mother, Lenora, was a woman who smelled of beeswax and turpentine, and who could look at a broken piece of furniture and tell you in 30 seconds exactly what was wrong with it and how to fix it. She ran a small upholstery and repair shop out of the side of the house. And from the time Hazel could walk, she followed her mother around that shop the way other children follow dogs or sunlight. She learned to strip cane from a chair seat before she learned long division. She learned the names of wood varnishes before she learned state capitals. Her father, Ray Birch, was a kind man with large, quiet hands and a weakness for other people's problems. He worked as a dispatcher for the county road crew and brought home every stray animal and hard luck story he encountered. He loved his daughter with an open and uncomplicated love, the kind that doesn't require anything in return. When Hazel was 9, a black ice patch on Route 7 ended that love without warning or ceremony, and the house on Granger's Bend became a quieter, colder place. Her mother kept the shop running for 2 more years. Then, in the autumn of Hazel's 11th year, Lenora sat down in her favorite chair to rest after a long day's work and did not get back up. The doctor called it a heart that had been working too hard for too long. Hazel called it the second worst day of her life, though she did not yet know what the first would be. She went to live with her father's brother, a man named Douglas Birch, and his wife, Patricia. They lived in a larger house in a town 40 miles west called Callum Ford, and they were not cruel people in any dramatic sense. There were no raised voices, no locked rooms, no dramatic confrontations. There was simply a persistent, grinding indifference, the kind that is harder to name and harder to fight than outright meanness. Douglas and Patricia had 2 sons of their own, both younger. Both the clear centers of the household's warmth and attention. Hazel occupied the spare bedroom and the edges of things. She was fed, she was clothed, she was enrolled in school and her fees were paid, and she was made to feel in 100 small daily ways that all of this was a generosity being extended at some cost to the people extending it. What saved her, or at least what kept her whole during those years, was a woman named Vera Osman. Vera Osman ran a small leather goods and saddle repair shop 2 blocks from Hazel's school, in a building that leaned slightly to the left and smelled permanently of neatsfoot oil and wood smoke. She was a woman in her late 60s, with close-cropped silver hair and hands that moved with a precision that was almost musical. She had learned leatherwork from her own father, who had learned it from his, and she practiced it with the seriousness of someone who understood that a thing done well is its own kind of prayer. She had no children. She had, by all accounts, no interest in acquiring any. But something about the 12-year-old girl, who stopped every afternoon to press her nose against the shop window, watching the curved needles pull, thread through leather, moved her to open the door one October afternoon and say, simply, "You might as well come in." Hazel came in. She never really left. For the next 7 years, she spent every afternoon and most of her Saturdays in Vera Osman's shop. She learned to skive leather to an even thinness, to punch holes in a perfect line with a stitching chisel, to saddle stitch by hand using 2 needles and a thread waxed with her own fingers. She learned to dye leather in deep, even coats and to burnish edges until they were as smooth as glass. She learned how to read a piece of hide for its weaknesses and its strengths, and how to cut around a flaw so that it never appeared in the finished work. Vera taught without sentiment. She corrected without cruelty. She expected good work, and she said so when she got it, which was all the praise Hazel needed. In the spring of Hazel's 17th year, Vera pressed a small leather punch into her hand and said, "This one is yours now. Don't lose it." The punch had a hexagonal rosewood handle, worn smooth and dark from decades of use, and a perfect 1/4-inch tip. It had been Vera's father's. Hazel understood without being told what it meant to be handed such a thing. She kept it in the breast pocket of every jacket she owned. 3 years after that, on a Tuesday in March, Vera Osman sat down in her workroom and did not finish the stitch she had started. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. She left her tools to Hazel in a will that Douglas Birch's wife Patricia called a touching gesture. in the tone of voice she used for things she found slightly distasteful. The shop went to a nephew in Nashville who sold it within the month. Hazel was 21. She had Vera's tools, the rosewood-handled punch in her pocket, $43 in her account, and a room in Douglas and Patricia's house that had never felt like it belonged to her. She applied for 2 jobs in town that spring. She didn't get either one. In May, she found a part-time position cleaning equipment at a veterinary clinic, which she worked for 6 weeks until the clinic hired the owner's niece for the same hours. In the middle of June, she came home on a Wednesday evening to find a white envelope propped against her bedroom door. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper in Patricia's careful, looping handwriting. It said that Ray's old room was needed now for Douglas's mother, who would be moving in at the end of the month. It said that Hazel had been a part of the household for 10 years, and they wished her well. It said there was a motel on the highway that offered a weekly rate, and that Patricia had included the number. There was a $20 bill folded inside the note. There was no signature. Hazel sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. She looked at the $20 bill. She thought about what Vera had told her once, when a piece of work had gone wrong and Hazel had wanted to throw it across the room. Sit with it. Don't throw. Figure out what the problem actually is, and then fix the problem. She folded the 20 into her pocket with the rest of her money. She packed her tools into Vera's old canvas roll, tucked the rosewood punch into her breast pocket, and put her clothes and her few other things into the same duffel bag she'd carried from Granger's Bend. She did not see Douglas or Patricia on her way out. She did not look for them. She started driving north with no particular plan, following the state highway, up through the hill country. Because she had always been told there was more room up there, more land that hadn't been claimed, more places where a person might be able to put down something that could stick. She stopped twice for gas and once for a road atlas at a truck stop. By late afternoon, she was in a part of the hills she didn't know, the kind of country where the road follows a creek for miles at a stretch, and the tree line crowds close on both sides. She stopped in a town called Holt's Ferry for gas and a cup of coffee at the diner attached to the feed store. The woman behind the counter had the comfortable, self-possessed manner of someone who had lived in the same place for 40 years and found it sufficient. Hazel asked if there was anything to rent in the area. The woman said not much. She mentioned a room above the hardware store, but said the owner was particular. She mentioned a house at the edge of town, but said it had been sold last month. And then she paused, refilling Hazel's cup without asking, and said, "There is the old Prentiss mill, but you don't want that." Hazel asked why not. The woman set the coffee pot down. It's been empty going on 12 years. Back before that, couple after couple tried to make a go of it up there. Nobody stayed. They say the creek floods it. They say the timbers are rotten. They say Ida Prentiss never left it, and she's been dead since 1987. She shook her head with the mild tolerance of someone who has learned not to argue with the irrational preferences of a landscape. County's been trying to unload it. Probably let it go for next to nothing, just to clear the lien. Hazel asked where she could find out about the lien. The woman looked at her for a moment, the way people look at someone who has said something that doesn't fit their expectations. Then she pointed across the street to a narrow building with a hand-lettered sign, Holt's Ferry Skankety Recorder, Property and Deeds, also notary. The man behind the desk in the recorder's office introduced himself as Calvin Meade. He was a small, organized man who moved through his filing system with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has built a world he understands. He listened to Hazel's question, pulled a folder from the second drawer of the third cabinet, and set it on the desk between them. The mill property was 5 acres on Prentiss Creek, including the mill building itself, a timber frame structure built in 1901, a small stone outbuilding, and access to the water rights. The county had held the lien for 8 years. The assessed value was nominal. The asking price to clear the lien was $14. It was every cent she had. The mill structure has some concerns, Calvin Meade said, in the careful tone of a man who does not want to be responsible for someone else's decision. What kind of concerns? He looked at the folder. The water wheel is seized. Part of the roof on the east side has come in. There was a report filed by the assessor 3 years back describing the interior as, and I'm quoting, substantially compromised but structurally present. Hazel thought about that. Substantially compromised but structurally present. She had heard worse descriptions of things that turned out to be worth saving. "I'll take it," she said. Calvin Meade looked at her, the way the woman at the diner had looked at her. Then he opened the folder to the deed transfer page and uncapped his pen. The mill was a mile and a half up a gravel track that followed Prentiss Creek, and she drove it slowly. The car's tires crunching over loose stone and creek mud, the tree canopy thickening overhead until the afternoon light came through in long, scattered columns. And then the track opened into a clearing, and she saw it. It was larger than she'd expected. The main building was 2 full stories of hand-hewn timber framing, gray and silver with age, the boards fitted with a closeness and care that spoke to whoever had built it knowing what they were doing. A wide overhang sheltered what had once been the loading bay. The east roofline had indeed come down. On one side the boards buckled inward, but the main ridgeline held straight and true as a ruled line. The water wheel was half submerged in the fast-running creek, its paddles swollen and green with moss. The stone outbuilding behind the main structure was small and square, and so solidly built it looked like it had grown from the ground. The door to the mill hung from 2 of its 3 original hinges. She pushed it open with her shoulder and went in. The air inside was cool and smelled of old wood, creek water, and the particular mustiness of a place that has been shut up long enough for the air itself to grow still. Dust covered every surface in a soft gray film. A family of swallows had built 3 nests in the upper beams. The old millstone sat in the center of the main floor, massive and immovable, surrounded by the collapsed remnants of the wooden housing that had once enclosed the gearing mechanism. In the corner, a cast-iron woodstove with a cracked door sat on a raised hearth of flat creek stone. But the bones were there. She could see them the way her mother had been able to see, through the worn velvet of a chair seat to the frame beneath. The timber posts were solid. The foundation stones, massive river rocks laid without mortar in the old way, were tight and true. The millstone, cracked in one quadrant but otherwise whole, was a beautiful thing. She walked the perimeter of the main floor, pressing her hand against each post in turn, the way Vera had taught her to handle a new piece of hide. Learning it before you commit to cutting. She spent the first night in her car, parked in the clearing, listening to the sound of Prentiss Creek running fast over its rocks in the dark. It was an honest sound. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. The next morning, she started working. She had Vera's full tool roll, which included 2 curved awls, a straight edge and mallet, the stitching chisels, and a dozen other tools specific to leatherwork. For the mill itself, she would need other things. She drove back to Holt's Ferry and spent 2 hours in the hardware store on what remained of her cash after the deed, buying a pry bar, a box of ring shank nails, a tube of roofing sealant, and a trowel. The man who ran the store, a methodical, unhurried man named Harold Speck, watched her pick through the bins without comment. When she brought her selections to the counter, he looked at the list she'd written on the back of the deed envelope and was quiet for a moment. "You're going up to the Prentiss place," he said. "It wasn't a question. I bought it yesterday." He looked at the list again. "You'll need a come-along for the wheel if you want to free it up. You can borrow mine." He went into the back and returned with a hand-operated chain hoist on a hook, the kind used to pull heavy machinery. "Bring it back when you're done." She thanked him. He nodded and made change without meeting her eyes, which she was coming to understand was his way of being kind. The roof was the first priority. She spent 3 days on it, working from the outside in, removing the buckled boards with the pry bar, stacking the ones that were still sound, and using the roofing sealant to seal the gaps before she could source replacement lumber. She learned quickly that the mill's roof was a steeper pitch than it looked from the ground, and that doing this kind of work alone required a patience with your own body that was different from any other kind of patience. There was no one to hold the board while you nailed it. You had to think 2 steps ahead of every action, bracing and blocking and propping before you committed your hands to anything. The interior she addressed one section at a time, the way Vera had taught her to approach a large piece of work. Don't look at the whole thing. Look at the part in front of you. Do that part right, then move to the next. She cleared out the collapsed gearing housing, working around the millstone with care. She cleaned the wood stove, replaced the cracked door panel with a piece of flat iron she found in the stone outbuilding, and tested it with a small fire that drew cleanly up the flue. She swept the floors 3 times before the dust stopped rising. She sealed the broken window on the north wall with heavy plastic sheeting until she could afford glass. She slept in the stone outbuilding, which was dry and weathertight in a way the main building was not yet. She had her sleeping bag, her tools, and a camp stove she'd bought at the hardware store. It was enough. She had lived on less in Patricia's house in Callum Ford, where she'd had a mattress and a roof, and no sense of having any claim to either one. She had been at the mill for 2 weeks, when she decided to address the wood stove's hearth, which was uneven and had begun to shift on one side, the flat stones tilting where the clay they'd been set in had dried out and crumbled away. She worked carefully, removing the stones one at a time, cleaning the old clay from their faces. Beneath the third stone from the left, a long flat piece of gray slate, she found a gap that shouldn't have been there. She used the flat blade of a screwdriver to pry the slate up further, and the gap became a void, about the size of a shoebox, carved deliberately into the base of the hearth. Inside the void was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of leather lace that had dried to a stiffness like wire. She carried the bundle to the doorway, where the light was better, and sat down on the threshold. She used the rosewood-handled punch from her pocket to break the leather knot. It was the right tool, she thought, for opening something that had been closed for a long time. Inside the oilcloth was a smaller bundle of tissue paper, and inside that, a cloth bag drawn shut with a drawstring. The bag was heavy in a way that shifted with a solid, settled weight. She opened it, and 14 Liberty silver dollars slid into her palm, catching the morning light. Beneath the bag was an envelope. The paper was yellowed and dry, the kind of dry that comes from a long time in the dark, and the handwriting on the front said simply, in a slanted, hurried script, "For the one who fixes the wheel." She opened it and read, "My name is Ida Prentiss. I was born in this mill in 1903, and I ran it for 60 years after my father died, and I loved this place the way you can only love something you have worked inside of for your whole life. When I write this, I am 81 years old and my hands are too stiff for the work, and my nephew in Knoxville wants me to come live in his spare room. I do not want to go, but I cannot stay. I am leaving this money here because I do not want my nephew to have it. He is not a bad man, but he sees this property the way most people do now, which is as something to be sold. These 14 silver dollars were my father's. He kept them because he said silver kept its value when paper didn't, and because he liked the weight of something real in his hand. I like the weight of them too. I am hiding them here under the hearth, because if someone loves this place enough to fix the wheel and the hearth and the roof and all the things that I know will need fixing, then that person has earned them. If no one ever does, then they can stay here. Silver doesn't mind the dark. I want to tell you about the mill. It was built by my grandfather, Elmore Prentiss, in 1901. He was a miller's apprentice who saved his wages for 11 years before he could afford the land. He built the wheel himself from white oak, and he was so proud of it that he carved his initials and the year into the axle housing. You may be able to see them still, if the wood has held. The millstone is cracked, but a cracked millstone is not a useless one. My father ground corn on it for 40 years after it cracked. The crack is in the quadrant away from the eye, and if you set the upper stone carefully, it will run true. The stone outbuilding is the oldest thing on the property. My great-grandmother used it as a smokehouse. The mortar in the north wall needs attention. It has needed it since I was young, and I always meant to get to it, and never did. I am sorry for that. I am leaving this mill to the county, because I cannot think what else to do with it. I hope the county finds someone who will not tear it down. I hope whoever reads this is that someone. I hope you are young, because it will take young hands to do what needs doing. I hope you are stubborn, because this valley does not reward anything else. Take care of the wheel. Elmore would want someone to know it was good work. Ida Prentiss, March 1984. Hazel sat on the threshold with the letter in her lap and the silver dollars in her hand for a long time. The creek ran fast beyond the tree line. A woodpecker was working somewhere in the pines above the clearing. She was not superstitious. She did not believe in curses or hauntings. But she believed in what she had just felt, which was the unmistakable sensation of one life passing something forward to another, across a distance of 40 years, through the medium of oilcloth and silver, and a woman's clear, practical handwriting. Ida Prentiss had loved this mill, with the serious and specific love of someone who had spent her life inside it. She had not been able to save it herself, and so she had done the only other thing available to her. She had left it for someone else to save, and she had left the means to do it, and she had told them what they needed to know. Hazel looked around the main room of the mill. At the millstone she now knew was still usable. At the timber posts her great-grandfather had raised. At the seized wheel outside that bore a man's initials carved into its axle housing. The place was not cursed. It was waiting. There was a difference, and it was an important one. She carefully refolded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it inside her jacket. She set the silver dollars in a row on the windowsill, where she could see them while she worked, and she went back to the hearth. The silver changed things. though not in the way that a large amount of money changes things. It was a practical sum. Enough to buy the lumber she needed for the east roof section. Enough for glass for the windows. Enough for a season's worth of food bought carefully. What it changed was not her material situation, but her understanding of what she was doing here. She was not squatting. She was not getting by. She was honoring something. She drove to Holt's Ferry the next morning and stopped first at the hardware store. Harold Speck was behind the counter, working through a stack of invoices with the focused calm of someone who has done this particular task 10,000 times. "I need to price out roof boards," she said. "White oak if you have it. And I want to ask you something." He looked up. The mill was built by a man named Elmore Prentiss. His initials are carved into the axle housing of the water wheel. "Do you know anything about him or his family?" Harold Speck was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who keeps things in order inside himself before he speaks. "I knew Ida," he said. "Not well. She came in once a month or so. Last year she was here. Stubborn woman. Good customer." He paused. "Her grandfather built the wheel, I know that much. People talked about it. Said he spent 2 winters on it. I'm going to free the wheel," Hazel said. "I used your come-along to break it loose. I think it can run again with new paddles." Harold Speck looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to his lumber inventory book and began to calculate costs, which she understood was his way of saying he approved. The person who helped her most, in the weeks that followed, was a woman named Bet Gould, who ran the diner, and who, it turned out, had grown up a mile from the mill and had known Ida Prentiss in the particular way you know an elder of a place, with respect and a certain careful distance. Bet Gould appeared at the mill one Saturday morning with a pot of beef stew and a look of frank assessment that reminded Hazel painfully of Vera Osman. "Harold told me what you're doing up here," she said, setting the pot on the wood stove without asking. "What did he tell you?" "That you bought the deed and moved in, and he lent you a come-along, and you've been up here working alone for 3 weeks. Bet Gould looked at the newly repaired section of roof, at the swept floor, at the silver dollars still lined up on the sill. "Ida would have liked you," she said, which was clearly the highest thing she could think to say about a person. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. She brought food, and she brought gossip, which was not the idle kind, but the informational kind. Who in the valley had a truck that could haul lumber? Who had experience with water wheel mechanics? Who might have stone-laying skills worth asking about? The man with the water wheel experience was a retired machinist named Vernon Quill, who was 73, and had a workshop full of tools he used every day, in a manner that suggested he found most people not worth explaining himself to. He came to look at the wheel at Bet's insistence, walked around it twice without speaking, crouched down to look at the axle housing and said, "That carving's still there, EP 1901. "I know," Hazel said. "I found a letter." He looked at her, from Ida Prentiss, hidden under the hearth. Vernon Quill was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll come back Thursday with my block plane. The paddle housings are rotted, but the spokes are white oak, same as the letter said. We can reface them." He paused. That wheel was good work. It would be a shame to leave it. That was all he said. He came back on Thursday. He and Hazel spent 2 weekends refacing the wheel paddles with new white oak boards, matching the width and thickness of the originals, seating each one with the same staggered pattern Elmore Prentiss had used 120 years ago. Vernon worked with a precision that Hazel recognized from Vera's shop, the kind that doesn't hurry, because hurrying is what causes the problems you then have to fix. He showed her how to check the axle alignment with a long straight edge and a plumb bob, and how to pack the bearing surfaces with tallow to reduce friction until the wheel was running free. On the day they tested it, opening the sluice gate that Hazel had repaired with new timber the week before, the wheel turned, slowly at first, grinding through the resistance of its own long stillness, then with increasing ease, the new paddles catching the current cleanly, the whole mechanism finding its rhythm with a deep, rhythmic groan that rose in pitch until it settled into a steady, working sound. Water beaded and flew from the turning paddles and caught the October light. Vernon Quill stood beside her and watched it run. After a moment, he said, "Elmore would have liked seeing that." Hazel thought about a man she'd never met, who had spent 11 years saving his wages to buy a piece of land by a creek, who had built a wheel from white oak and carved his name into it because he was proud of it, who had dreamed of something lasting. She thought about Ida, who had loved the thing he built and had run it and maintained it and finally been too old to keep it going, and who had hidden 14 silver dollars under the hearth for someone she didn't know and trusted to find them and do right by them. She thought about Vera Osman, who had handed her a rosewood-handled punch and said, "This one is yours now," and then left her with skills that were turning out to be useful in ways neither of them had imagined. She was not a miller. She did not know what she would do with a working mill, not exactly. But she knew what it meant to have a thing you were capable of. She knew what it meant to have learned something thoroughly from someone who cared about thoroughness. And she knew, standing in the clearing with the sound of the turning wheel and the running creek and the woodpecker somewhere above her in the pines, that she was not a person passing through. She was a person who had arrived. Hazel kept the letter in the envelope inside her jacket for a long time. At night, in the stone outbuilding with the camp stove and her sleeping bag and Vera's tools laid out in their roll beside her, she would sometimes take it out and read it again, not because she had forgotten what it said, but because some things are worth sitting with more than once. The property records at Calvin Meade's office listed Ida Prentiss's next of kin as the nephew in Knoxville, which was the only lead she had. She wrote him a letter, a thing she had not done in years and had to think carefully about. She told him she had purchased the mill and was doing restoration work. She told him she had found a personal letter inside the property, written by his aunt in 1984. She told him she would like to send it to him, if he wanted it. He wrote back 2 weeks later on the back of her envelope, in handwriting that looked like his aunt's in the slant, but not the care. He said he had not known about any letter. He said he had not been to the property since the funeral. He said he would be glad to have the letter if she wanted to send it, but that if she was fixing the place up, it sounded like it was in good hands, and Aunt Ida would have approved. He signed it RP, which was all. She sent the letter and kept the envelope. In November, the first cold settled into the valley, and the creek slowed and went gray-green along the banks, where the cold came off the rocks. Hazel had the roof sound, the windows glazed, the wall chinking replaced, the hearth rebuilt level and true. She had a new door, hung straight on 3 new hinges, that swung and sealed with a solidity that satisfied her every time she opened and closed it. She had a wood stove that burned clean. She had a bunk frame she'd built from salvaged mill lumber, using mortise and tenon joints. She'd learned from watching a YouTube tutorial twice, and then practicing on scrap wood until she could do it without thinking. She had used Vera's tools in ways Vera had not specifically taught, but in the spirit of what Vera had taught, which was, understand the material, respect the work, and don't cut corners because you can't see them. That principle turned out to apply to timber framing and stone laying and roofing with approximately the same force as it applied to leather. On an evening in late November, she was sitting on the threshold of the mill with a cup of coffee, watching the wheel turn in the last light. The creek was lower now, and the wheel moved more slowly, but it moved, steady and even. Harold Speck had come up the week before to see it, standing with his hands in his pockets, nodding in the slow, considered way of a man who gives approval infrequently and means it when he does. Bet Gould had brought a jar of apple butter and 2 pieces of pie and called it a celebration, which it was. Vernon Quill had said nothing, but had come back the next day with a length of new axle hardware he said she might need in the spring, and left it by the door without knocking. On the small shelf she'd built beside the doorframe, she had placed 2 objects. Vera Osman's rosewood-handled punch, its tip still sharp, its handle worn to a dark satiny finish by 2 people's hands across 50 years. And next to it, one of Ida Prentiss's Liberty silver dollars, which Hazel had kept back from the rest. It caught whatever light was in the room and held it. She looked at the 2 objects and thought about what had found its way into her hands. The punch was the skill, the inheritance of a specific and serious knowledge, the quiet recognition of one pair of hands by another, the proof that she was capable. The silver dollar was the gift, the forward-thrown hope of someone who had loved a place and trusted that love to travel across time and land on the right person. She had come to Holt's Ferry with $14 and no plan. She had a plan now, or the beginning of one. The mill could be a working space, not for grinding. She was not a miller, but for leather. She had been thinking about it since October, since the day she'd laid Vera's tools out on the millstone and realized that the quality of light in the main floor, coming through the glazed windows onto the wide horizontal surface, was the best working light she had ever had. There was room for a bench. There was room for a drying rack. There was room, maybe, to teach, if she ever felt ready to do for someone what Vera had done for her. That was further off. For now, there was the mill and the creek and the valley that had stopped being unfamiliar and started being home in the way that things become home. Not by a decision, but by an accumulation of ordinary days. She thought about Douglas and Patricia in Callum Ford, going through their ordinary days in their warm house with their 2 sons. She did not hate them. She found sitting here that she didn't feel much about them at all, which was its own kind of peace. They had done what they were able to do for her, which was not enough, and she had found her way to a place they would never have thought to look for. A leaning mill on a fast creek in the hill country, where a woman she'd never met had left her a letter and 14 silver dollars and the specific information that the millstone was still good and the north wall needed attention. The north wall had needed attention. She'd gotten to it. The wheel turned in the last of the light. The creek ran over its stones with the sound of a thing doing exactly what it was built to do. Hazel Birch was 21 years old. She had $14 to her name, and she had spent every cent of it on a mill no one else would touch. It was the best $14 she ever spent. We think about Hazel sometimes, when we hear stories of places that people have given up on. Houses, towns, old buildings that everyone agrees are past saving. We think about what it means to see potential where others see a problem, to have the skills and the stubbornness to act on that seeing. And we think about Ida Prentiss, who knew she couldn't stay but believed, enough to put 14 silver dollars under a hearthstone, that someone worth trusting would come along. Maybe you know a place like that. Maybe you know a person like that. Someone that the world had already written off, who turned out to be worth more than anyone bothered to calculate. We'd like to hear about it. Tell us in the comments. And if Hazel's story meant something to you, share it with someone who's still looking for the door that's theirs to open. We'll see you at the next fire.